Chapter 19. Man, ever since he heard me call my mama's name, Herman E. Calloway had locked himself in his room, and he wouldn't come out. Mr. Jimmy and Miss Thomas made me sit at the kitchen table whilst they knocked on his door and tried to talk to him into opening it up, but the way they kept saying Herman, soft at first, then louder, it sounded like he wasn't talking back. After the longest while, they decided to let the big baby have his own way, and they came back downstairs. They sat at the kitchen table with me. Miss Thomas looked at me and said, My. Mr. Jimmy said, Now, look here, bud. He wiped his hand over his face. You're sure your mama's name was Angela Janet? I said, Yes, sir. And the two of you both had the same last name? Her last name was Caldwell, too? She never said nothing about being a Calloway? I spelt it out for him. No, sir. Her name was Caldwell. Caldwell. It seemed like he finally believed me. He said, Okay. I sure hope you don't mind me asking, Bud, but it's pretty important that we know. How'd your mama pass? How long ago was it? Pass was just like gone. What another one of those words growing up folks use instead of dead. I said I was 6 years old when it happened, sir. I don't know why. She was too sick to go to work for 6 days in a row. One day I went into her room and she was dead. But she didn't suffer or nothing. It happened real quick. She didn't even have time to close her eyes. I didn't look like it hurt or nothing. Miss Thomas reached across the table and touched my arm and said, I'm sure it didn't, Bud. I'm sure it was very peaceful for her. Mr. Jimmy said, When she was living, Bud, God rest her soul, what'd your mama look like? There was another strange question, but before I could answer, Miss Thomas said, James, what are you insinuating? I knew there was something familiar about this boy. I don't know how I missed it before, but look at Bud's eyes. You have to ask if this is Herman's grandchild? Mr. Jimmy said, Now hold on, Grace. I'm just trying to ask questions. I know Herman asked if he could. Ain't a thing wrong with being certain before we jump into any conclusions. Now, what'd she look like, son? I said she was real pretty, sir. Mr. Jimmy said, I bet she was, Bud. But that ain't what I meant. Was she short, or tall, or slim, or big boned? Well, I said, I don't know, sir. She was pretty and real tall and skinny like me, I guess. Miss Thomas said, James, Bud was 6 years old. Everybody on earth was real tall to him. I don't see the point of all this. I said, Pardon me, ma'am. I know how I can show you what she looks like. I still got her picture. They just stared at me. I said, Can I be excused? Miss Thomas said, Yes, son. Hurry up and go get that picture. I busted upstairs and stopped like I hit a brick wall. Remember how mad and crazy Mr. Herman E. Calloway looked when he yelled at me. I tiptoed up to the rest of the steps. Uh-oh. Herman E. Calloway's door was open, up a crack. I held my breath, tiptoed extra quiet and extra fast into the little dead girl's room. And as soon as I did, whoop, zoop, zoop, my heart jumped down into my stomach. Herman E. Calloway was sitting there in the little chair in front of the little mirror in the dressing table. His elbows were on the table, his face was covered by his hands, and it sounded like he was having trouble breathing because every time he sucked in a bunch of air, he made a sound like and every time he blew out air, it just sounded like But I didn't know what to do. I could tell Mr. C didn't know I was in the room with him, so I could probably just back or tiptoe and get out of there without anything happening. I rose up on my toes, took 2 baby steps back, stopped. Shucks, I come here to show Miss Thomas and Mr. Jimmy what my mama looked like. There wasn't nothing wrong with that. I wasn't doing nothing that meant I had to sneak out of this room on my tiptoes and going backwards, so I sucked up a mouthful of air, walked over to my bed, picked up my sacks case, and then I set it on top of the bed. I pushed two silver buttons in the side, and the two silver tongs jumped open and made that loud click, click sound. Hermione Calloway still didn't take his face out of his hands. He just kept I reached inside my sax case, took out the envelope with Mama's picture in it. I closed two silver tongs again, and I could tell Mr. C was paying me no mind at all. He kept his face in his hands. His head was rocking up and down real slow, sort of like he was checking out to see how much he weighed. I put my case back in next to the bed and was about to leave the room, and I looked over at Hermione Calloway's back. He still didn't know I was in the room. I looked in the little round mirror, still couldn't see his face, but I could see his hands a lot better. I could see six little trails of water coming out from his fingers, joined up with his hands. Three trails from each hand joined together at his wrist and ran down his arms, puddling on top of the dresser table. Shucks. Hermione Calloway was bawling his eyes out. He was acting like me with his grandson on the worst news that anyone could ever give him in his life. This was number 39 of Bud Caldwell's Rules of Things to Have a Funner Life and Make You a Better Liar Out of Yourself. Rule and Things number 39. The older you get, the worse something has to be to make you cry. With babies, it's easy not to pay attention, no mind, because crying is like it's like talking for a baby. A baby's tears might mean, "Hey, you just stuck a pin in my behind when you changed my diaper." Or their crying might be the way they picked out to say, "Good morning, Mama. Where we gonna do today?" That makes it easy not to care too much about baby's tears. When you got an old person crying, you got a whole nother story. And when you got one as old as Herman E. Calloway crying, you better look around, 'cause you know you're square in the middle of one of those boiling tragedies. You can't help but feel sorry for him, even if he's been mean to you from the minute he first lays on you. Even if he's crying 'cause he found out that two of you were his kin. I walked over to Herman E. Calloway, and before I could think, my hand moved towards the back, and I waited for one of those square spaces between the mohos, and I touched him. His skin under his shirt was very, very warm. Took several seconds for Hermione to know that someone was touching him. When he knew, I felt his skin jerk and twitch the same way horses do when a fly lands on them, and they whip their head around. When he saw it was me, he jerked away, took one more huh, and then stared, his mouth staring and moving like he was talking in a secret language that only dogs could hear. At last, American words started coming out of his mouth. He said, "Ah, how, how, look, buddy, it's Bud, sir, not Buddy." He put his face back in his hands and broke down all over again. "Man, it's a good thing me and Thug wasn't around. 'Cause if he'd heard the way Mr. C was weepin', no one would have wondered what the real Waterworks Willie was." I put my hand on his back, and Mr. Sheehan patted him and rubbed him a couple times, and then I left the room. I felt a lot better going out the front ways instead of sneaking out backwards. I ran down the steps, back into the kitchen. Miss Thomas and Mr. Jimmy's eyes jumped right onto my envelope. I set it in the middle of the table. Both of them just looked at it before Miss Thompson reached in and picked it up. She went to the pocket of her dress book and took out some funny little glasses that only had bottom half to them, and she put them on her nose. She pulled Mamma's picture out and held it as far away from her eyes as her arms could stretch. She looked at that picture, she looked it over her glasses, and then she looked at me and right at Mr. Jimmy and said, "And more questions for this young man?" She slid the picture over to him. Mr. Jimmy picked it up and said, "Well, I'll be. Remember that old con man who used to drag that run horse through town? Now, what was his name? Help me out here, Grace. Didn't he call him, like, Act Joey Pegas and the broke back bronking bucko?" Miss Thomas said, "It was Joey Pegas and his broke back bucking bronco, James. What else do you see in that picture?" Mr. Jimmy said, "Uh-huh. That definitely is Angela Janet Calloway." He looked at me and said, You sure this is your mother?" I said, "Yes, sir, but her name's Caldwell, not Calloway." He said, "Well, I'll just be—" Miss Thomas butted him in on him. "This little doubt about that, James. But what we've got to do—" She kept talking, but I quit listening because when something came out of the a blue gave me a good whoop right in my forehead without even thinking about what I was doing. I butted in on Thomas and said, "That means that that's not some little dead girl's bedroom I'm sleeping in. That's my mama's room." She looked at me kind of surprised, like this was the first time she'd thought of it too. She said, "That's right, bud. You're back where your mama was in your mama's room." I said, "How come Hermione Calloway never called on me or my mother? All he had all he had to do was call on us one time and I know she would have been there. She wouldn't have been so sad." Miss Thomas and Jimmy took turns shooting down quick looks at each other. Then she said, "Bud, give me your hand." Uh-oh. Pretty soon I'd have to come up with rules and things about Miss Thomas's holding your hands. She stretched her arms out across the table and I held on to her fingers. "Bud," she said, "Mr. C, excuse me, your granddad don't know anything about you. No one knew where your mother had gone." Jimmy said, "That's right, son. She just up and ran away one day. I mean, we all knew Herman was hard on her, but it wasn't like it was nothing personal. He was hard on everybody. I used to tell him all the time, slack off on the girl, to go easy, but I can remember his exact words. He said, 'Easy, go, don't make a mare run.' This is a hard world, especially for a Negro woman. There's 100 million folks out there, and every shade and hue, both male and female, and just those dying to be harder on her than I ever could be. She's got to be ready. Shoot, I could see that girl wasn't the type to." Miss Thomas said, "James, why don't you go up and check on Herman?" "Why?" She said, "Why don't you—" But it wasn't a question. Mr. Jimmy said, "Oh, maybe I should," and he left the kitchen. Miss Thomas told me, "Bud, I know you can see your granddad has troubles getting along with most folks, right?" "Yes, ma'am." "I think because he expects so much out of everybody, himself included, and when you set your standards so high, you get let down a lot." I shook my head up and down like I understood. She said, "Now take your mother, for instance. He was so proud of that young woman, and he loved her very, very much. He was determined that she was going to be the first Calloway to get schooling all the way through college, so he thought he had to be strict on her. But he went overboard, Bud. Simple as that. He used to crow about how his mother and father had been born slaves, and now it was only 2 generations later, and the Callaways had come so far and worked so hard that one of them was actually going to be a teacher. It was his dream, not hers. Not yet, anyways. And he never ever gave her time to pick it for herself. The more he pushed her, the more she fought him. Finally, it got too much and she left. We think she ran off with one of Herman's drummers. We've been hoping for 11 years that she'd send word or come home, or she finally has. Looked to me like she sent the best word we've had in years." Miss Thomas smiled at me, and I knew she was trying to say that I was the word my mamma had sent to them. She said, "Wait here for a second, precious. I've got to go to my room for something." Miss Thomas was probably saying that to excuse her so she could go blow her nose and cry, but she came back in a flash and was holding an iron picture frame. She handed it to me. "This has been in my dressing table for 13 years, Bud. Ever since your mother was 16 years old. Now it belongs to you." I wanted to say thank you, but I just stared at the picture in the heavy frame. It was Mamma. The picture only showed her head. All around the edges was smoky and foggy, so it looked like Mamma's poked her head out of a cloud, and Mamma was smiling. The same soft smile she'd give me when she got home from work. It'd been so long since I'd seen Mamma smile that I wanted to laugh and cry at the same time. "Miss Thomas," I said, "let me show you something, Bud." She took the frame out of my hands and said, "Watch this." She moved the picture up and down, right and left, and then around in circles. "Do you see how her eyes or on you all the time, no matter which way you look at the picture? She's watching. It seemed like Mama was looking directly at me, no matter where Miss Thomas put the picture. I can keep this? I feel like I've been holding on to it until the rightful owner came along, and it looks to me like he's finally shown up. What took you so long, child? Miss Thomas patted me underneath the chin. She said, But Bud, we've got a problem. I'm going to need your help with it. Uh-oh. You said you were 6 years old when your mama died. Yes, ma'am. Okay, so that was 4 years ago. Yes, ma'am. You can remember how bad you felt when you first knew she was gone, can't you? Yes, ma'am. 'Cause it feels the same. Well, you've had 4 years to try to heal from that scar. But it still hurts some of the time, doesn't it? Sometimes a lot. I know, Bud, but remember your grandfather and I just found out that she passed. The hurt is brand new for us, Miss Thomas said, started swallowing. And even though she hasn't seen her in 11 years, I know there isn't a day that goes by that he doesn't think about her. He would never admit it, but he isn't one to show that we give that what he doesn't first look out the into the audience, not to see how big the crowd is, but hoping that she'll be out there, hoping that she'd be seen the flyer tacked to the telephone pole somewhere and would stop by and see him. He loved her so much, Bud. Sorry, sweetheart. She took the hand that was she wasn't squeezing, met with my fingers, and then took out a handkerchief and blew her nose. Those stones that he picked up everywhere he performs are for her. She must have been 4 or 5 years old. The band getting ready to travel to Chicago for a week. Before we left, he asked her what she wanted him to bring back for her, and she was thinking a doll or a dress or something, but she told him, A walk, Daddy. Bring me back a walk from Chicago. So everywhere he went, at, after she'd have to get her walk, he'd write the city and the day and where they were from for her. He's got a box of them upstairs, 11 years worth. So, Bud, I don't know how Herman is going to be feeling after this. Where I need your help is you've got to remember that both Herman and I love your mother as much as you do. This doesn't seem like it could be true. Not just because it didn't seem like anyone could love my mother as much as I did, or as I do, but because it didn't seem like Herman E. Calloway would love anyone at all. Miss Thomas said, So if you can remember, Bud, be patient with him. That ornery old man upstairs is very, very hurt right now. And I can just say where he's going to land after this news gets through blowing him around. Miss Thomas was starting to do that stinky eye blinking. So we're going to have to give him some time. We're going to have to let him know how he feels before Mr. Jimmy came into the kitchen. Grace, he said, he wants you. Herman E. Calloway was making everybody feel like they had the blues. It looked like Mr. Jimmy just wiped some tears away from his eyes too. Miss Thomas came around on the side of the table, gave me a hug, and she said, "You okay?" I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Well, should I go see how he's doing?" "Yes, ma'am." She left the kitchen and Mr. Jimmy went into the living room. I picked Mama's picture up and put it back in the envelope. Mr. C chose a good name for his house, 'cause not a second went by before the back door came open and dusky devastators of depression walked in, talking like it was going out of style, and as soon as they saw me, they got all quiet. Doodoo Bug said, Hey, Sleepy LeBone, where's everyone at? I didn't want to embarrass anyone by saying that all the grown up folks were sitting all over the house sobbing their eyes out, so I said, they're around. I remembered not to call the band sir. Steady said, Well, it's you we wanted anyways. He put an old cardboard suitcase on the table and said, I told you the fellows how hard you've been hitting the recorder and how proud I was of you. And so we put a couple of nickels together. He acted like he was yelling it into the other room. And Lord knows, on the peanuts we get, is a real sacrifice. He slapped some skin with Dirty Deed, then starting to talk regular again. Anyway, said Thug. We saw something in the pawn shop and we picked it up for you. Can I open it? Thug said, well, if you don't, I don't know who will. Eddie slid the cardboard suitcase over in front of me, and it looked like worse than the one I used to carry around. One of the snaps on it was busted clean off, and the other one was stuck. Steady Eddie said, it's inside that's interesting. Just pull out that snap real hard. So I pulled the snap and it came off right in my hand. Then Thug said, I knew it. The boy's just too country. He ain't used to handling merchandise. We should have given it to him in a paper bag. I opened the suitcase. Whatever it was wrapped in some crinkly, wrinkly newspaper. So I started pulling out the newspaper, and I could see their gift was real heavy. All of a sudden, a shiny piece of gold showed up through, and I snatched more paper off. I couldn't believe my eyes. The dusky devastators of depression had put their money together and bought me a baby sized horn like Steady Eddie's saxophone. Steady Eddie could see I was stuck, so he lifted it out of the suitcase, fished around the bag for a mouthpiece and the neck and the reed holder. Then he sucked on the reed for a minute, put the horn together, and then played it. Man, my horn sounded great. Eddie said, it's an alto, bud. There's a little rust in the seams, but that's got to be expected with a horn that's this old. It'll be it's still got a good tone to it. And this dent here, that don't throw her out too much. He showed me a big dent on the bottom of the saxophone. I repatted and refelted and resprung it. The rest is up to you. He reached in his pocket and took out a can that said Brasso on the side. Get your rag and shine her up, man. A man should polish his own horn. I looked at my bandmates and they said, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very, very much. I'll practice on it so much that I'll just be as good as you guys are in about 3 weeks. Doo Bug said, oh, now, Chat, that's cold. I said, really, I will. The band laughed, so did I, too. Eddie said, well, Mr. LeBone, I'll tell you what. Since you're so hot to get in this band, I better get you started with lessons right away. So he pulled out a big silver watch that was tied up to the long chain on his pocket and said, I'm going to be at Tyla's for a while now, but I'll be back around 7. If you've got your sax all polished up, I'll bring a sheet of music along and we can get started. Sound good? His toothpick jumped from each word. Sounds great, Steady. Eddie took the strap off the neck and handed it to me. I put it on, and Eddie handed me the saxophone for the first time. It was perfect weight. I said, can I be excused? Dirty D said, what? You ain't gonna blow some notes? We want to hear what you got, Mr. 3 weeks from now. I said, I'll let you hear me in 3 weeks when when we're all on the stage together. They laughed again, and Thug said, I'm gonna let you know in on something, Sleepy LeBone. There's a certain members of this band that you will be out playing in 3 weeks, but it's gonna take you a whole lot longer to top me. On the real tip, it's gonna take you at least 10 years before you'll be able to even hold my drumsticks. Steady Eddie said, yeah, and that's about 9 and 10 months longer than it will take you to be with the band, Thug. Thug said, aw, man, you ain't gonna start that up again. Gotta let me know what you heard. I said, can I be excused? Eddie said, go ahead. Go on, Sleepy LeBone. I'll be back. I told the bandmates, thank you again. Thank you very much. The Thug said, nothing to it, little man. Dirty Deed said, now don't let the horn whip you, son. Bug said, our pleasure, Sleepy. Steady Eddie said, man, get out of here. I picked up both my mama's pictures, my horn, and the can of Brasso and ran upstairs. When I got upstairs, I saw Herman E. Calloway's door was still open a crack. Miss Thomas's door was closed now, and I could hear the two of them in her room talking real soft to each other. So I could have stood outside the door and listened, and I wanted to, but that would have been rude. Besides, I didn't know for sure how long it would take me to polish my new horn. So I went into my mother's room. I put on the sax on the bed that Mama used to sleep in when she was a little girl. I sat put her smiling picture on the dressing table. Then I reached under the bed and pulled my sax case out again. I snapped the two new silver snaps and started taking out all of my things. I took my old blanket, my old remade bed with it. I wasn't going to need to carry it around with me anymore. I opened my tobacco pouch and took out the rock that said Flint on it and set it back on the bed. I took the pouch of the flyers and walked down to the hall to Hermione Calloway's room, even though I could still hear him and Miss Thomas talking and boo-hooing in her room. I knocked on his door anyways. With no when no one answered, I opened it. He had one of those dressing tables with a mirror stuck on the back too, so I walked real quick over to it and set the flyers and the bag of rocks down. I got out of his room as fast as I could. Phew! Even though it was me who carried them around all these years, you'd have to be pretty big liar if you'd say those rocks and flyers really belonged to me. Hermione Calloway's name were all over the flyers, and his writing was all over those rocks. Besides, the way he looked so shook up when he saw those rocks was for the first time I figured they meant more to him than they did to me anyways. So I went back over to Mama's dressing table and I opened the little drawer and I took out one of the thumbtacks and went back to Mama's bed. Next, I took out the envelope that had the picture of her. I took out the pictures of her riding the sad, saggy pony. I still couldn't see what she was so unhappy about. The Miss B. Gotten Moon Park looked like somewhere you could have had a lot of fun. So I poked the thumbtack through the top of Mamma's picture, walked to the wall that she'd stuck all the pictures of horses on. I put Mamma right amongst all those ponies and horses that she liked so much. I didn't need to carry that doggone picture around now how I remembered Mamma anyways. Mamma was always excited and jumpy, not sad and poky like this little girl. Mamma was kind of old when I met her too. She was young like this. She wasn't young like this in this picture at all. The picture looked like it belonged. It's strange the way things turn out. I've been carrying Mama around all this time, and I finally put her somewhere where she'd wanted to be back in her own bedroom, back amongst all her horses. So I'm back to the bed and pick up the flint rock up. It was going to be enough. I didn't need those other things with me all the time. I didn't need them to remind me of Mama. I could think about her. I don't couldn't think about her any more if there were 100 hours in every day and 1,000 days in every week. I couldn't think of my mama any better than I already do. All I have to do is remember her hand on my forehead when she'd ask me something like, "Baby, are you sick? Have you got a temperature?" All I have to do is remember Mama letting me dry the dishes after she'd washed them. How she used to say, "No one in the world could dry a plate the way I could." All I have to do is take 2 or 3 deep breaths and think about all the books she used to read me at night and remember that no matter how long it took her, she'd read until I went to sleep. Daisy Malone was right. I was carrying Mama inside me, and there wasn't anyone or anything that could take me away from that or add it to it either. The one rock from Flint would be enough. I set it on my sax case. I picked up my saxophone. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I wet the reed the same way I'd seen Steady Eddie do, and I clamped on the mouthpiece. I closed my eyes, counted 10. After I got to 10, I blew in the horn and sounded pretty good. I knew I'd be playing along with the dusky devastators of the Depression in a week or two. If I didn't sound so good, it meant I'd have to practice for a couple months before I'd be good enough to be on stage with them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Puffed my cheeks and blew as hard as I could. The saxophone only squeaked and squawked and groaned, then sounded like it was making up the words like rock, rock. Shucks. Maybe I didn't puff my cheeks out right. Maybe I was blowing too hard. Counted again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. This time the horn only squeaked, squawked, and groaned. It didn't make sounds like it was trying to make up any words. It sounded great. It wasn't perfect, like when I blew steady, but I could tell that one day it was going to be. Something told me I could learn how to play this. Something told me that those sounds were more than just bad notes. If you don't have a real good imagination, you'd probably think those noises were sounds from some kid blowing a horn for the first time. But I knew better than that. I could tell that those were the squeaks and squawks of one door closing and another door opening. I looked at the picture of Mama that Miss Thomas gave me. Mama was looking at me with that same soft smile. I know it's stupid to smile back at a picture, but I couldn't help myself. I know it's even stupider to talk to the picture, especially if it hadn't when it hadn't said anything to start the conversation. But I had to. I had to say, "There we go again, Mama." Only this time I can't wait. I closed my eyes, began practicing. Shucks, as good as things were going for me now, I bet you dollars to donut Steady Eddie was going to get here early. Afterward, although Bud Not Buddy is fictional, many of the situation Bud encounters are based on the events that occurred in the 1930s during the time known as the Great Depression. And although the characters in Bud Not Buddy are fictional as well, some of them too are based on real people. One of those most enjoyable parts of writing is that as an author you can combine his or her imagination with the traits of real people to build new characters. That is what I did to create the characters of Lefty Lewis and Herman E. Calloway, both of whom are based loosely on my grandfathers. My mother's father, Earl Lefty Lewis, was one of the 6 or 7 recaps who worked on the train station in Grand Rapids, Michigan during much of the Depression. The jobs of Pullman Porter, the Red Cap, were among the few open to African American men at the time that carried certain prestige in the black community. Nonetheless, they were extremely difficult jobs, often marked with 80-hour work weeks, low salary, and virtually no job security. These men could be fired for simply not looking happy enough. Grandpa Lewis did exceptionally well during the Depression. He supporting his family on the trips he received as a red cap. My mother remembers my grandmother used to have to sew reinforced linings into the pockets of all Grandpa's pants because the weight of the pennies and nickels and dimes and occasional quarters that he was given as tips would eventually rip the seams out. She also remembers the leathery texture Grandpa's hands took from carrying much of the baggage to the station. The depression depended deepened in the Grand Rapids train station and cut 2 red caps, and Grandpa was let go. He briefly opened a small restaurant, finally became the first African American cab driver in Grand Rapids. He held the job until his retirement until 1972 at 74 years old. Earl Lefty Lewis also pitched for many years in the minors of the Negro Baseball Leagues. His fondest memory of all that time was pitching twice against Satchel Paige. As he did with most opposing pitchers, Satch hung Grandpa with 2 losses. My father's my father's father, Herman E. Curtis, was indeed a big band leader for most of his adult life. He headed many musical groups, and my favorite was the Herman E. Curtis and the Dusky Devastators of the Depression, a name that by itself deserves all 6 of those exclamation points. Grandpa attended the Indiana Conservatory of Music and was classically trained violinist. He also played a bass fiddle, an accordion, and a piano. Entertainment was an important part of life during the Depression for people who wanted to forget their troubles, and going to the movies or sitting around the radio and listening to dancing to live music. Grandpa and his bands were well known throughout Michigan during this time. Being an orchestra leader was Grandpa Curtis's night job. By day, he wore many different hats, among them those of a chauffeur, a boat captain, a truck painter. He owned several businesses in Grand Rapids and Wyoming, Michigan. At that time, the laws prohibited African Americans from renting or holding a title on these 2 cities. Grandpa did this by having a white friend put his name on all the records. The flexibility, people skills, hustle, willingness to work around unfair laws and situations that both of my grandfathers allowed us to keep their families together during America's bleakest periods of time. That was especially hard for African Americans. Both of these men were great, fortunate, skilled enough to avoid the brunt of the Great Depression. The lives of Earl Lefty Lewis E. Curtis and the situations described in Bud Not Buddy are the exception, for the great majority of people suffered greatly during the period between 1929 and 1941. Parents often couldn't feed their children. Countless thousands of young people, some as young as 8 years old, were abandoned or had to get out on their own in search of a meal and a warm place to sleep. These children survived a brutal life on the road by riding the rails, picking fruit, doing odd jobs, begging, stealing, or whatever was necessary to get food. Much of what I discovered about the Depression, I'd learned through the research and books, which is a shame. I didn't take advantage of my family history that surrounded me for years. I'm afraid that when I was younger and my grandparents and parents would start to talk about their lives during the Depression, my eyes would glaze over and think, oh gosh, not those boring tales again. And I'd find it most convenient to excuse I could get away from them. Now I feel sorrow whenever I think of that knowledge and wisdom and stories that I could have been forever with the deaths of my grandparents. Be smarter than I was. Go talk to your grandma. Go talk to your grandpa, your mom, and your dad, and your relatives and your friends. Discover and remember what they have to say about what they learned growing up by keeping their stories alive and by making them yourself immortal. So this is his dad's dad in the band, and this is his dad's grandpa or his mom's dad, Lefty Lewis. Really good book.